In the early years of the Weimar Republic, several political factions did not begin by outlining economic reforms or cultural programs. They began by naming enemies. Their speeches were structured less around construction and more around resistance. Resistance to humiliation, resistance to decay, resistance to infiltration. What unified their followers was not a shared blueprint for the future. It was a shared defense posture. This pattern has appeared repeatedly across political systems: democratic, authoritarian, transitional. An identity forms. It encounters pressure. Defense becomes its organizing principle. The question is not whether threats exist. The question is, what happens when identity requires constant defense in order to remain coherent? Because when opposition becomes foundational rather than strategic, something structural shifts. Conflict stops being episodic. It becomes architecture. When identity forms around opposition, the external adversary performs an unexpected function. It simplifies complexity. Political systems are unstable by nature. Economic outcomes are uneven. Cultural transitions are difficult to narrate. But opposition creates clarity. An enemy reduces interpretive ambiguity. It allows disparate grievances to compress into a single explanatory frame. Individuals who might disagree on policy can agree on threat. The threat becomes adhesive. Over time, language begins to narrow. Debate contracts. Internal variation becomes risky. Because if cohesion depends on shared defense, disagreement begins to resemble disloyalty. The identity no longer organizes around what it intends to build. It organizes around what it intends to resist. Resistance is reactive by design. It requires stimulus. It requires friction. Without opposition, the architecture weakens. This is not unique to any ideology. Revolutionary movements, nationalist movements, reformist coalitions, many have discovered that defensive identity produces rapid cohesion. But defensive identity also requires maintenance. It must continually signal pressure. It must continually interpret events as encroachment. Otherwise, urgency fades. At first, this posture feels strong. It clarifies boundaries. It strengthens vigilance. It produces unity. But it also alters how information is processed. Ambiguous events are interpreted as hostile. Neutral actors are sorted into adversarial categories. Institutional disagreement becomes existential. And once opposition becomes the central organizing principle, escalation becomes structurally attractive. Not because individuals necessarily seek conflict, but because conflict stabilizes the identity. An identity built around vision can survive quiet periods. An identity built around defense cannot. Silence destabilizes it. Calm weakens it. Absence of threat creates interpretive drift. And so the system becomes highly sensitive to signals, real or symbolic, that confirm danger. This is where opposition stops being strategy and becomes infrastructure. When identity requires constant defense, it alters three domains simultaneously: language, institutions, time. A defensive identity narrows vocabulary. Nuance becomes inefficient. Ambiguity becomes suspicious. Complex explanations are replaced with signal words: betrayal, invasion, corruption, erosion. These words function less as descriptions and more as alarms. Language shifts from analytical to protective. An alarm-coded language reduces gradation. Everything begins to feel urgent, even when it is not. Over time, interpretive flexibility diminishes. A system that once debated possibilities begins categorizing threats. Disagreement is no longer variation, it is risk. Institutions shaped by defensive identity reorganize around preservation rather than experimentation. Internal critics are viewed cautiously. Procedural rigidity increases. Cohesion becomes the priority. Externally, this posture often strengthens short-term unity. Internally, it reduces tolerance for divergence. Institutions built around opposition can mobilize quickly, but they struggle to evolve quietly because evolution requires looseness, and looseness resembles vulnerability. Perhaps the most subtle cost emerges in temporal perception. When identity depends on threat, the present becomes permanent crisis. The future is imagined as either victory or collapse. The past is selectively reconstructed as proof of continuity. This creates a closed interpretive loop. History validates defense. Defense validates identity. Identity validates opposition. Opposition validates history. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing, not through conspiracy, through architecture. A defensive identity is not sustained by conflict alone. It is sustained by interpretation of conflict. The external event is secondary. The interpretive frame is primary. This is why two groups can witness the same event and derive entirely different existential conclusions. Because the stability of the identity depends on threat recognition. Remove the threat, coherence weakens. Intensify the threat, coherence strengthens. That is the structural trade. Over extended time, identities built around defense face a paradox. They require stability to survive, but they depend on instability to remain unified. Calm periods create fragmentation. Crisis periods create cohesion. The system becomes rhythmically reactive, not necessarily by design, but by necessity. An identity built around defense may function effectively during genuine instability. In moments of collapse, occupation, or rapid transformation, defensive cohesion can produce survival. The difficulty emerges when the emergency posture persists beyond the emergency itself. Emergency language does not scale across decades. Perpetual vigilance produces exhaustion. New generations inherit the alarm system without inheriting the original threat context. The defensive reflex remains. The referent weakens. The posture survives longer than its clarity. At small scale, defensive identity strengthens tight groups. At national scale, it behaves differently. Large populations require internal diversity to function, but defensive architecture interprets diversity as vulnerability. What stabilizes a coalition can destabilize a society. The mechanism does not disappear. It amplifies. Opposition becomes the dominant organizing language of public life. Coordination weakens. Polarization intensifies, not because conflict is desired, but because opposition is structurally central. When defensive identity transfers into new cultural contexts, friction increases. A narrative that unified one generation may alienate another. A threat frame that mobilized one demographic may not resonate with a different one. But because identity coherence depends on defense, adaptation becomes difficult. To revise the threat narrative risks destabilizing cohesion. To maintain it risks irrelevance. The structure tightens. In environments where external threat genuinely decreases, defensive identity faces its most difficult moment. Stability, calm, institutional normalcy. Without friction, internal differences surface. The adhesive weakens. What once unified through resistance must now justify itself through vision. Defensive identity is optimized for containment. It is not optimized for expansion. The paradox remains unresolved. Defensive identity produces cohesion. It also produces rigidity. It strengthens boundaries. It narrows possibility. It can preserve institutions. It can exhaust them. The question is not whether opposition is necessary. In many historical moments, it has been. The question is what architecture remains once opposition becomes permanent. Because when identity requires constant defense, it does not merely respond to conflict, it reorganizes around it. And structures reorganized around threat rarely return unchanged.